All right, the next thing we're going to cover is a normal sinus rhythm. So we already said, so what do you know about it? You should know this. It's basically everything we just covered. So a normal sinus rhythm looks exactly like you see. Let's talk about the parts you see. Well, we're going to have a P wave. Well, let's change that pointer size here. Sorry about that. So we're going to have for instance, we're going to have a P wave. We're going to have a QRS, and we're going to have a T. So of course, we've got a P, we've got a QRS, we've got a T, and you may or may not see a U, okay? But we should definitely have a P, QRS, and T, and everything should be in the right amount of time. So the P wave, unless we're talking in leads A, V, R, and V1, the P wave should be upright and rounded, should take place within 2 little boxes. The QRS should be narrow, should take place in less than 3 little boxes. This is all normal. Okay, in the T wave, it's going to be slightly larger than the P wave, but should also be upright and rounded, and it should go in the same direction as the QRS overall. The PR interval should be less than 1 big box, and the QT interval should be less than 2 big boxes. Or if the rate is fast, there again, it's going to be 1/2 the R to R interval. Got it? All of that, those are all the criteria for normal, okay? And if the rate is between 60 to 100 beats per minute, then we would say it's a normal sinus rhythm. So we said a normal sinus rhythm should have a P, QRS, and a T. The P wave should be the right amount of time, QRS, right amount of time. T wave should be in the same direction as the QRS. The PR interval should be in the right amount of time. The QT interval should be the right amount of time. And the rate is 60 to 100. If all of that is happening, that's a normal sinus rhythm. Now, in terms of the heart, what part of that? That's going to be right here. The pacemaker is right here at the SA node, okay? That's what you need to know for normal sinus rhythm. And it's so important that you know all of this because, for instance, let's say, here, let me show you how we can apply this. For instance, let's say the P wave, instead of being upright and rounded. So remember how I say it's so important that you know normal. It's hard to recognize abnormal if you don't know normal. Let me show you what I mean by that. Well, a normal P wave is upright and rounded. Well, what if it's, for instance, inverted? That's not normal. Well, that could, for instance, be, when would it be normal to have an inverted P wave? What lead is that? In V1, remember, everything V1 should be 100% negative. So in V1, the P wave is supposed to be upside down. But if you're looking at another lead outside of AVR and V1 and the P wave is upside down, that probably tells you there's a problem. So if the P wave is upside down, that could be, for instance, a junctional rhythm. What if the P wave has, for instance, 2 humps instead of 1? Okay, remember the P wave deals with the atria. So if we have a P wave with 2 humps, that's probably going to be, for instance, atrial what? That's going to be atrial enlargement or atrial dilation, okay? Now, for instance, when we have 2 humps, the first hump tells us the first one is for the right atrium. The second one is for the left atrium. Whichever one is largest, that tells us where the abnormality is. So if I have this situation where let's draw that a little better. Let's do it like this. Let's say that in this situation, this first part is bigger. We would say there's right atrial enlargement. On the other hand, let's say I have this situation where the second part is bigger. We'd say we have left atrial enlargement, right? So just by me knowing normal very well, I can more easily figure out abnormal, okay? Now, what if, for instance, the PR interval is too long? So instead of it being within 1 big box, what if it's longer than that? Well, now, more than likely, I have a block, for instance, a first-degree AV block. We're going to cover that. What if, for instance, the QRS is supposed to be narrow? Ooh, let me back up for a moment. What if the P wave, for instance, is tall? Okay, now that's probably atrial hypertrophy. Well, what would cause the atria to get thicker? Well, that could probably be due to volume overload over time. So for instance, let's say they have tricuspid stenosis and we can't get blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle. Well, if I do this over time, it's going to cause this right atrium to get larger. That would be a tall P wave. Okay. Let's go into the QRS. It's supposed to be narrow, but what if the QRS is instead wide? Okay. A wide QRS means that there's some kind of ventricular problem. It's often associated, for instance, with a bundle branch block or some other kind of conduction delay. So a wide QRS could be a conduction problem. It could be a bundle branch block. It could also be, for instance, let's say you have ventricular dilation. So let's say you have eccentric hypertrophy due to volume overload. By the way, what heart sound is that? We've already covered it. That's going to be an S3 heart sound due to a volume problem, but that's going to stretch out our QRS. On the other hand, what if the QRS is tall? Not what still would be wide, but what if it's really tall? That's going to be indicative of hypertrophy more so than dilation. So a wide QRS is more indicative of ventricular dilation. So let's say dilated cardiomyopathy, but a tall QRS is more indicative of hypertrophy. We're going to cover hypertrophy in greater detail today. Okay. Now, let's say obviously, if we're talking about the ST segment, we're going to look for elevation versus depression in the ST segment. So what I'm saying is just by knowing normal, we can quickly figure out abnormal. However, if you don't really understand normal well, you're not going to find a lot of these things. Remember, you don't find what you're not looking for in the EKG. What if the T wave, for instance, this is a normal T wave, but for instance, what if this T wave is wider? Well, we know that the T wave means ventricular repolarization. If it's wider, that means it's taken more time for ventricular repolarization to occur. But if the ventricle doesn't repolarize, it can't reset to be able to start the next heartbeat. So everything is going to stretch out. Okay? What happens if this T wave, for instance, is peaked? Okay, that's often indicative of hyperkalemia. So we've got elevated potassium. Well, what is potassium normally supposed to be? Remember, we covered all this already. What's potassium? So some books will say 3.5 to 5. Other books will say 3.5 to 5.5. But what I want you to know is definitely greater than 5.5 is indicative of hyperkalemia. So for instance, in hyperkalemia, not only are we going to have maybe a peak T wave, but it's also going to, for instance, start to affect, it will affect the QRS. That'll start to stretch out. It'll affect the P wave. It'll affect the PR interval. So hyperkalemia, you're going to start seeing other changes in the EKG as well. What if you have a prolonged QT interval? Well, what could cause that? Remember, we talked about anti-malarial drugs. We talked about class 3 antidysrhythmics like amiodarone. We said that amiodarone affects, even though it's a class 3, so a potassium channel blocker, it also has an effect on sodium channels, calcium channels, and potassium channels. Well, what do we know based on what we said here? If amiodarone works on potassium channels, sodium channels, calcium channels, what did I just say? I said amiodarone works on everything. So amiodarone can affect the entire cardiac cycle. It can affect every part of the EKG. What else do we know? What did we talk about earlier in terms of one of the classic side effects of amiodarone? Anybody remember? So that amiodarone, of course, can cause, for instance, pulmonary fibrosis. So we call that the amiodarone blues, where they now have stiff lungs, so they have trouble with inspiration, getting air in. They become cyanotic. That's the blue part of amiodarone blues. So just remember that. Oh, what's another medication that can cause things like pulmonary fibrosis? So amiodarone, I just said, but also, for instance, the cancer drugs like bleomycin, busulfan, those can also cause pulmonary fibrosis. So you see how we're able to tie in a lot of stuff together? All right. We were just on normal sinus rhythm. Let's get that back on the screen. All right, I covered that. Let's move on.